side tonight. We're going to talk about identifying dyslexia in our ESOL learners, which is a topic that's very close to my heart. I've spent quite a lot of years figuring out how we could do this. And as Pauline says, if you've got any questions, do just stick them in the chat box. And at the end, we'll come back to them. There may be time as we go along as well to see if there are any questions as we go. We'll see how it goes. I may have some questions for you as well, so be ready to scribble something in the chat as we go. So, identifying dyslexia or other specific learning differences in our ESOL learners, it's not a straightforward thing to do. It's actually quite complex, and I'm guessing that all of you lovely people have turned out this evening because this is something that you've come up against, and it's something that you perhaps feel you'd like to know a little bit more about. So in this session, we're going to be talking about why this is important, what exactly it is that we're looking for, and then the big question, what do we do then? What's the next thing that we could do if we think that we spot dyslexia or another specific learning difference? And I just want to say, before I go on, that we talk about dyslexia quite a lot. That's, you know, one of the most commonly identified specific learning differences, but it doesn't normally travel on its own. It has friends. And so I use the term specific learning difference, which is like an umbrella term, but I also use the word neurodiversity or neurodivergence to talk about that kind of cognitive difference that you sometimes see. And sometimes it's not even clear, is it dyslexia or is it dyspraxia, or is it a kind of a combination of both? Because with the best will in the world, assessors, and I have to admit here that as well as being an English language professional, I am a dyslexia assessor. With the best will in the world, we can only assess what we're trained to assess, to identify. And in the case of dyslexia assessors, most of us are only supposed to identify dyslexia, although we might see the dyspraxia, we might see some autistic traits, but we wouldn't be qualified to write that on the report. That would be the job of a different professional. I'm afraid the whole system is a little bit complex like that. So as teachers, it's worth knowing that if by some chance one of your students does come to you with a report that says dyslexia, it's worth looking to see what else is going on. Now, I know that it may not be very likely that many of your students will come already with a report, but it does happen sometimes. So just to be aware that when we talk about dyslexia, really, we're talking about a whole cluster of specific learning differences, which very commonly co-occur, and individuals will have a combination of features, if you like, from the different SPLDs. We'll talk about that in a second. So the term neurodivergence is a term which is quite useful, I think. It reminds us it's about the neurodiversity of the human population. You know, we're all wired slightly differently, but there are some people who are more different, shall we say, and we could call that neurodivergence. It's a term that's been applied mostly to autistic people, but I think it applies to everybody who's on this diagram here. So it's a different way of perceiving the world. It's a different way of processing the information, and particularly of interpreting the sensory input that's coming into us all the time. I mean, we are constantly monitoring our environment, whether we know it or not. But the way that we interpret that data, for some people, is quite unusual. It's quite different from the majority of the population. Now, this is a very broad definition. You might find more specific definitions on websites like the British Dyslexia Association or Dyslexia Scotland, but I do find that it's quite difficult to pin down what exactly dyslexia is, for example, because everybody's different. Every individual will experience it in a different way and manifest in a different way. But what I have seen amongst all the students that I've worked with over the last 20 years, what I've seen is that they are understanding the world differently. They're processing differently. So that's, you know, a sort of very broad definition to get started with, I guess. So here's a question to get you started. Do you know if any of your learners have dyslexia or another specific learning difference? If you could just put in the chat box, yes, definitely you know. No, you're sure that none of them have dyslexia, or not sure. If you could just quickly, we'll just get an overview of where we are with that. We've got some yeses, we've got some not sures, some yeses, some not sures. Yes, 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 yes. Got a no, got some not sures. Quite a lot of not sures. Yes, in the past. Not sure because of the similarities with EAL. Yes, absolutely. Suspect. Think a few. Not sure. Yeah. And this is the picture that we very often get in ESOL and working with students who are using English as an additional language. It's quite hard to tell sometimes. And if you're in a college, for example, or a school where there's a learning support team, sometimes you'll go to them and they'll say, well, you know, we can't assess them because they don't speak English well enough, or give them another few years and then we'll see. And it's really hard because as language teachers, we know we need to act now. We can't wait 3 years because in 3 years' time, that student will have gone or given up. So there's a lot of uncertainty about this. And, you know, rightly, some assessors will say, we don't have the tools. Well, this evening, I'm going to show you some tools that you could use, and you could share it with any assessors or learning support staff that you work with to help them in that. Those of you who said yes, that's very positive. It sounds like maybe some people are assessing already, and that's great. Because generally the figures given are about somewhere between 8 and 12% of the population have some form of neurodiversity or a specific learning difference of some kind. So statistically, you would think you would have at least one student in a class, depending how big your classes are. And certainly, you know, over your career, you will definitely meet some learners who do have dyslexia. So it's good to be aware and good to know what we're looking out for. And I've already touched on some of the reasons why this is so important. And I think for English language teachers, it's especially important. I mean, it's important for all teachers, for every education professional, but for ESOL teachers and EAL teachers, it's particularly important. We are often, I would say, often the only people that some of our learners meet on a regular basis in terms of, you know, authority figures, if you like. I don't know if you're ready to be classed as an authority figure, but some people would see us as such. We might be the first people to pick up on their learning difficulties, because this might be their first experience of formal education. So we might be the first people to see them in a classroom tackling these kinds of tasks that we're setting them. So it's really important that we are aware and we know what we should be looking out for and then what we should be doing. I mentioned, you know, the importance of not waiting 3 years until they can speak better English, because students whose specific learning differences are not identified will probably not progress fast enough to get to that level where, you know, their English and their cultural knowledge is good enough for the assessors to use the assessment tools which are based on English. And unless we know the best way to teach them, they're going to experience a lack of success. And as this goes on year after year, their self-esteem will get lower. They'll begin to believe that they can't learn. And then sure enough, they won't learn. They'll become disengaged. And many of them sadly will end up leaving education before they've really reached that potential that they have and before they have any useful qualifications to go on. So not identifying, I think, is a really bad choice. If it's a choice, it's, you know, it can lead to quite a lot of negative outcomes. So that's a bit of a negative reason why it's so important. But there are positive reasons too. Studies have shown, for example, that adults who are successful in adulthood often have a degree of self-awareness and self-knowledge, which helps them to make good choices. So knowing how we work, knowing about ourselves is really, really valuable. It helps us to make choices in education. So we can choose a course which is going to be good for us. It helps us to choose a career path which we're going to like and which is going to, you know, play to our strengths. And in other life decisions like who would be a good partner for me, or where would be a good place for me to live, all of this self-knowledge is really useful in making those kinds of decisions. We're likely to make better decisions the more we know about ourselves and our strengths and things that we find difficult. So when we recognize SBLD in a student and we can guide them towards finding how they work best, that's, you know, we're sort of helping them with so many other things as well. And the other thing that I've got here is that students who have experienced failure or lack of success in the past often do feel quite down and quite sort of reluctant to keep trying. But if they find out that there's a reason why, like a really clear reason why they didn't succeed, and it's not because they're lazy, they're not stupid, it can be really, really empowering for them. And if we encourage them to think, okay, now we know what the issues are, we can find ways to support you, we can get around those barriers, that's really empowering, and it could give them a whole new sort of a boost in their self-confidence and in their learning. So that's a really, really powerful reason, I think, to be aware of what we're looking out for in terms of specific learning differences. Before we go on, are there any questions at this point? If you want to put anything in the chat. Forget assessment. Yeah, lack of schooling in the home country is, yeah, that is a big barrier to learning, obviously, you know, people who haven't had the experience of being in formal education. Yeah, okay, so I'm not picking up any direct questions at the moment, in case maybe somebody's frantically typing, but anyway, if you think of anything, we can always come back to it at the end. So, what is it that we're looking for? Could you just jot down in the chat what you consider to be the key characteristics of dyslexia? What do you think we should be looking for? And if you just pop it in the chat, I'll have a look and see. So what's spelling, memory? Oh gosh, it's going really fast. I'm not sure I can keep up with all this. Spelling, memory, concentration, reading, spelling, processing, memory, spelling, not wanting to participate in writing, yeah, not picking up the alphabet, organization of text. Oh, white on black sheets, visual mind, poor memory, issues working memory. Okay, I'm sorry if I missed yours. It was literally just scrolling past me so fast. But yeah, these are the things that we would normally look for in trying to identify students who may have dyslexia or another form of neurodivergence. Those are the classic symptoms, aren't they? People talk about spelling and also memory and speed of processing. If we're talking about dyslexia, yeah, the classic indicators are indeed to do with processing text, literacy practices, and also things like explaining ideas in an order that other people can follow. I don't know if any of you have got students or possibly colleagues who do this. They start telling you a story, and then, but they're like butterflies, and they kind of flit from flower to flower, telling you a little bit about several different things. And it's like, you have to try and follow them and try and figure out which flower we're on now, which story are we actually telling now. I don't know if you've got any students or colleagues like that, but it's quite characteristic of dyslexia specifically, neurodiversity generally, that they make different connections between things. So what to them seems like a logical connection, to me seems like, I don't know how you got there. And I find it really hard to follow. So that could be quite characteristic of dyslexia. Now, the problem that we have, and I think somebody's already flagged this up in the chat, is that when it comes to spelling, or indeed reading and writing, the kinds of difficulties that we see, particularly in mature ESOL learners, may not be dyslexia, but may be due to just lack of educational opportunity, or familiarity with another alphabet, another orthography completely, such that English is very strange. And let's face it, English is quite strange. So problems with spelling in English, I think we've probably seen quite a lot of our students, and the same with reading quickly, reading fluently. We probably see that in quite a lot of our students. It may not be due to a cognitive difference, but it may. So we have to look at other things to see if we can, you know, decide what the actual issues are, what the barriers are to progress. If we think about this diagram here, which is showing us that dyslexia often does overlap with other specific learning differences, although that seems to make life a lot more complicated, actually for us, it's a real bonus, because in most of our students, we may see some issues with literacy development in English. But if we also see some of the characteristics that we more commonly associate with ADHD, dyspraxia, or autism, that may be a big clue for us that there's something else going on. So the key characteristics of ADHD is, as you already know, I'm sure, about attention. And actually, ADHD is just the worst name. It's the worst name for any kind of condition. It's not attention deficit. It is that they are paying attention to everything. The normal inhibitors that most of us have to block out things that are going on elsewhere so that we can focus on one thing, those inhibitors are not working. So people with ADD are actually paying attention to everything all at once, all the time. And just think for a minute how exhausting that would be, to have to process everything that's going on. So luckily, many of them also have hyperactivity, which seems to give them a lot of extra energy to do all that processing. But the hyperactivity, which often accompanies the attentional and focus issues, the hyperactivity often leads to restlessness, fidgetiness, and also issues about controlling their emotions. And you may have students in your class who one moment seem to be having a great time and everything's, you know, great fun, and they're getting on brilliantly with everybody. And then the next minute, something's happened. And what to most of us might be just, you know, mildly irritating, for them it's like the worst thing ever. And they're absolutely furious and they've fallen out with everybody. And we see these very volatile swings in emotion. As people get older, often they learn to control that and manage that behavior. If you've got younger learners, even teenagers or young adults, you might see them still trying to get control of their emotions like that. But even with adults, we see issues around taking turns. So some people with ADD find it very, very difficult to wait. You know, when they ask a question, their partner is supposed to answer. If their partner is not processing as quickly as they are and don't respond immediately, you can see sometimes they kind of get bored and they just give the answer anyway. And sometimes if you throw out a question to the class, there is you know, one student who cannot wait to be asked, but absolutely has to contribute what's in their head at that moment. It's that impulsiveness that's quite hard to manage. So these are the key characteristics that we might see of ADHD. Dyspraxia, I'm sure you're also familiar with this. It's about the sequencing of movements, shows up quite a lot in coordination. We might see it in handwriting, but again, to be honest with you, most of my ESOL learners, their handwriting is, you know, at the early stages. So it's hard to tell if their handwriting is affected by dyspraxia. You sometimes find it affects articulation as well. Now, again, a lot of my ESOL students, their pronunciation of English isn't that well developed either. But if you notice that there are several sounds that they're really, really struggling to sequence and to produce clearly, even with practice, it might be worth just asking them if they have that problem in their own language as well. They might be aware that actually they do sometimes mistime their pronunciation in their own language. Dyspraxia is an interesting SPLD. Not only is it about coordination and the sequencing of movements, but it's also about spatial awareness, so judging distances, judging time, and it also has an element of environmental sensitivity. So you may see students who are very, very sensitive to the lighting, the temperature, the noise. You may see students who are just uncomfortable all the time in their clothing. I had a student who was constantly pulling at his shirt and he was obviously always aware of, you know, what was on him. In fact, my niece, one of my nieces, wouldn't wear socks. She's dyspraxic. She wouldn't wear socks because she didn't like the feel of the elastic around the ankle. She couldn't bear it. And so she would refuse to wear socks. And of course, her mother then would get into trouble for sending her to school with no socks in the winter. But the funny thing was, she wasn't sensitive to temperature. She didn't know that her feet were actually really cold. She didn't feel that. She only felt the pressure. So people can be oversensitive or undersensitive to different types of stimuli. So if you've got a student who really prefers to sit in a dim corner or constantly seems to be worried about the temperature, or, you know, those are maybe some indicators that there's something to do with their environmental sensitivity going on there. Now, environmental sensitivity, of course, could be indicative of autism as well. That, you know, that's a shared characteristic. But students on the autism spectrum, usually their key problem is to do with the social interaction in the classroom, the pragmatics of the language. You may find that these students actually have really, really good memories, that they can remember vocabulary, you know, phenomenally well, and facts and grammar rules. But unfortunately, of course, in English, learning a grammar rule, it's not the end of the story, is it? Because there's so many anomalies and exceptions and irregularities in English that, you know, that could actually be quite upsetting for them. The irregularity, the inconsistency could actually be, yeah, a little bit problematic for them. And I've got a note here as well about metaphorical language, but I think that applies to quite a lot of our ESOL learners anyway, that our idioms are problematic. So yeah, so students on the autism spectrum might know the grammar, they might know the vocabulary, but they might not be so good at knowing what to say to whom and when to say it and how to say it. So they might say all the right words in the right order, but it's just not appropriate. Or their intonation pattern is, you know, it gives a different meaning. Or so there are those sorts of things to be on the lookout for, as well as their general social interaction with their classmates. And finally, I've put dyscalculia on here, which is mainly about numerical and temporal concepts, but it does have an impact on language learning because the temporal concepts and time expressions are very closely linked to tenses, of course, and knowing which tense we should be using to express, you know, when did it happen, before, after, during. You know, it's if your grasp of a timeline is not that strong in your own language, it's going to be even more of a challenge to do it in a second language, to express those sequences in a different language. So I put dyscalculia on there as well. It's, you know, these 5 are perhaps the most commonly identified specific learning differences. By no means the only ones. Of course, there are many, many more. And it seems to me every time I go to a conference, there's a new specific learning difference that somebody's discovered or named. Or so in some ways, it's much easier to think about the umbrella term of specific learning difference or neurodiversity. Because that, you know, kind of catches everybody there. And what's quite important is this central ground here, the overlapping area here, where we see issues around memory, speed of processing, organization, like people were saying in the chat. Students who very quickly forget what you've just been talking about or what you've just asked them to do. Students who perhaps need a little bit of extra time to process the instructions or to formulate their answer or to complete a task. Their speed of processing may be a bit slower. Conversely, students with ADD, their speed of processing may be just actually a little bit too fast. Their motors are just running so fast that they're not really able to process things in detail or focus on the accuracy. So what we're talking about here, if we think about sort of normal distribution, most of us are in the middle with a sort of typical speed of processing. There are some people who are a little bit slower, need more time, and there are other people who are processing too quickly and actually just need to take a breath and slow it down. So we're talking about the outliers when we're talking about neurodivergence, rather than the sort of main body of population. You know what I mean, the normal distribution. We're looking for atypical characteristics, really. Organization, organization of ideas, we've mentioned organization of ourselves as well. Students who habitually turn up in the wrong room at the wrong time, having done the wrong homework. It's, you know, classic dyslexia or neurodiversity. And I've also put on here self-esteem, because it really does have quite a dramatic effect. And those of us who are working with adults, you know, after years and years of never quite doing as well as you hoped, despite working really hard, it grinds you down, you know, and you begin to believe that you're not as good, or you begin to believe what teachers have told you, that you are stupid or you are lazy. And it really does have an effect on learning, because it makes people sometimes reluctant to try, or it makes people just withdraw and just not want to interact, which in a language classroom is, you know, not ideal. But it can also show up in terms of overcompensating. So if you've got students who come across as actually a little bit arrogant, a little bit too sure of themselves, just ask yourself, are they possibly overcompensating because they do feel actually quite sort of vulnerable, and this is their way of protecting themselves? So low self-esteem can actually show up in quite, you know, surprising ways. And I've also put on good and bad days. And I know we all have good and bad days. And yeah, over the last year, I'm sure many more of us have had fewer good days. But the students that we're talking about here are students for whom good and bad days can be very, very extreme, like night and day. So one day your student may come to class and be absolutely on the ball, alert, keen, doing really well, you know, doing everything you ask them to do. And then they come the next time and it's like they've sent their twin. They can't remember what you did in the class. They have no recollection of the things you talked about, and they're lacking energy and motivation, and they don't want to be bothered. It's like a different person. And I think this is because people who are processing in a different way, it takes a lot of energy to keep processing. And if they have a really good day, that's probably because they put everything into it. And then, of course, inevitably you get a bit of a slump and they need time to recover. So it may be that you hit them on a bad day when they're in recovery from a day before when they had a really good day. And the difference is really, really dramatic. And all I can say that, you know, there's nothing we can do about that except to recognize it, acknowledge it, accept it, cut them a bit of slack, and just, you know, hope that the next time they come, it'll be a good day for them. That's all we can do. So here we've got quite a lot of the key characteristics of individual specific learning differences, but I'm sure you can see there's quite a lot of overlap there, particularly in the yellow section. So the things that we're looking out for are things like speed of processing, memory that just seems not as quite as reliable as might be hoped, issues with organizing, and particularly we're looking for unexpected discrepancies. The thing about students with specific learning differences is that they can always surprise you. And that's what actually, it's quite a joy to work with them, because you never quite know what's coming next. But in terms of discrepancies, you might notice students who are developing quite well their speaking and their listening, but their literacy is not keeping up. Or it might be that there's a discrepancy between how engaged they are in class, and then their homework is like, you can't quite believe it's the same student that's handed in this homework, given, you know, their behavior in class. It's like there's a big mismatch somewhere, or with their exams, for example. So you're looking for unexpected discrepancies and also unusual connections. I'm sure you've had similar experiences when maybe you throw out a question to the class, like, let's say, for example, we're planning a holiday, what would you put in your suitcase? And you're standing there ready to write what everyone, and people are saying, sunglasses, okay, sunglasses, sunscreen, right, shorts, good, food mixer. What, food mixer? Really? And somebody has, you know, made this connection that when they go on holiday, that's what they put in their suitcase. And it's like, okay. And you have to, you know, accept that for them, that's something they would want to take. And it's sometimes worth exploring, because sometimes there's quite a good reason why. But, you know, it does sometimes just stop you in your tracks, and you just sort of think, wow, what's going on there? So, yeah, unusual connections, different ways of thinking, different ways of working. These are the hallmarks, really, of specific learning differences. These are the things that we perhaps should be looking out for. Now, I should say as well that, as I have mentioned, some of these things might show up in a lot of our learners. And what we have to do is to try and figure out which are developmental differences that have always been there, and which are the result of perhaps trauma, social and emotional upset, or, you know, and it's quite tricky. It's quite tricky to disentangle it sometimes. But the more we get to know our learners, the better able we are to try and decide what the root cause is. So yeah, getting to know our learners is really key to all of this. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Any other indicators that you'd like to add? Anything you'd like to ask, comment on? Sensitivity of proximity to others, Julie, yes. Yes, you sometimes get students who actually need a whole table for themselves. And that might be to do with their personal organization, where they've got their books and their pencils and everything's got to be just how it is. Or it might be because they're really not aware of where their elbows are. So actually sometimes they do need a bit of space, just, you know, so they're not interrupting other people. Colander, Simon. Is that going in your suitcase? Okay. Catherine's saying, can dyslexia cause similar issues in writing and other types of languages of the world? Catherine, yes, it can. The thing about dyslexia is that it's not language specific. So if somebody is dyslexic, they are dyslexic. Now, some languages are easier for them to process. English orthography is notoriously difficult and undyslexia friendly. But yes, dyslexia can definitely cause issues in any language that they're learning. And that there have even been cases of students who have done better in a second language than their own language, just because the second language that they learned somehow just fitted better with the way their brains worked. You know, the individual differences are hard to predict. Kate's saying, can we talk a little more about the effect of trauma on learning differences? So we could talk all night about this, Kate. What I would say briefly is that many of our students have experienced trauma. You know, migration is never easy, and forced migration obviously is, you know, a very, very difficult situation to deal with. If a student has a specific learning difference, any kind of trauma or stress is probably going to exacerbate it. So it may be that in their own countries they had, you know, their lives were fine, and nobody picked up that they had a specific learning difference. Maybe their education system was such that they could manage it. Maybe their literacy practices were such that they were on top of it. It was absolutely fine. Having to relocate to another country where they're using a completely different language, maybe a different writing script, that is likely to exacerbate any underlying cognitive difference, I would suggest. It is quite hard to disentangle the effects of trauma and the effects of learning difference, learning difficulty, but I would say, yeah, trauma is likely to make things worse, I'm afraid. Okay, so let's go on then and think about, if we were to spot some of these things that we've been talking about, what do we do? What can we do? We have a student in our class, we've been watching them for a while, we think, there's something different about this student. What do you think we could do? I've got a question for you. Does your college or your organisation have a clear procedure for how to identify and support your ESOL learners with SBLDs? I say clear procedure, any procedure, clear or otherwise. I'm thinking about FE colleges that I've worked in. What have we got? We've got a no, we've got a not for ESOL. No, they get rejected. And come back when your English is better. Oh, Sue Wallen saying yes. Sheena saying no, not specifically for ESOL. No, ignored. No, because of language, yeah. Yeah. And this, you know, is, oh, Kate saying home language assessment. Oh, brilliant. Okay. And Mecca is saying it's clear, but unfortunately ESOL students are not eligible, but you do offer support. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, Kate, it's difficult to disentangle. Yeah, and I'm afraid this is a story still. When I was teaching ESOL in an FE college, not far from here, about 20 years ago, this was a situation. And it came to my attention because I was actually working in the learning support team and in the ESOL team. And half of my week I was assessing students who needed exam arrangements, and none of them were ESOL. And then I got to asking questions like, why aren't we assessing the ESOL learners? And I was just told, well, we can't because they don't speak English. And I just thought that is so unfair, really. It's unjust, and we need to change it. So I did start working then on trying to put together some materials so that we could make a start. When I say we, I mean the ESOL community, because the dyslexia community are moving in our direction, but they've still got quite a long way to come, I'm afraid. So our colleges, our organisations may not have a clear procedure, but like some of you were saying, that doesn't mean that we can't. There's still things that we can do. So I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly because I've got an eye on the time here. The first thing that we need to do is observe. And I know that, you know, teachers are observing all the time. That's what we do. We can't help ourselves. Right from the start, we notice which students are coming in late, which students are getting started quickly, which students, you know, need a bit of extra help. And we start to build up a kind of mental profile of all of our learners. But to make it just a little bit more systematic, I would suggest using something like a record sheet like this, where you can just note down any behaviours that you've noticed that you think are interesting, the date that you first noticed them, and then how often you notice them after that. Because, you know, anyone can have an off day and come at the wrong time, or you know, turn up in the wrong class unexpectedly. But if that happens a lot, then yeah, we need to take it a bit more seriously. So it's just about looking for patterns really, and seeing what the consistent behaviour patterns are. So the behaviours that you might jot on there might be things like, yeah, turning up late, not taking turns, not wanting to work with other students, not remembering your name. Even after several months of teaching them, they don't remember your name. You know, it could be anything that you think is unusual or interesting in some way. So that's the first step, I would say. And this record is quite useful, because you can ask colleagues to contribute too. If there's anybody else that's working with the students, and I know at the moment we're doing a lot of remote teaching, and it may be that you're the only person that they're seeing, and they're online. It's not the same at all. But when we return to live teaching and college life again, it may be that there are other members of staff who could chip in and say what they've seen in different situations. Maybe people that work in the canteen, or if there's any kind of extracurricular activities, maybe they could just contribute their perceptions as well, so that you get a more rounded view of what's going on with the learner. So observation is the first thing. And from that, you might want to have a chat with the learner and just say, we've noticed this, wonder what you think about that, see how aware they are of their timekeeping, for example, or their homework hand-in rate, or whatever it is that you've picked up on. Just see what their perceptions are. It's just a way of starting that conversation, of getting into that channel of communication. And at this stage, we need to really reassure them that they're not going to be kicked off the course. We're not trying to get rid of them. We want them to succeed, and this is how we're going to try and help them to learn more English and succeed. Remember that some students may have had quite difficult educational experiences in their home countries. It may be the case that in some countries, if you are, dyslexic, or if you're not succeeding academically, you're off the course or you're out of the school. We want to be really clear that that's not what we're about. So that's an opportunity just to have an informal chat and just start that ball rolling. You might want to work through a little checklist, and you've probably, I don't know if you've seen these, you might have seen these, a little checklist that asks about, for example, when they were younger, what was their eyesight like, what was their hearing like, what were they like at PE, how well do they sleep, asking about their daily lives, basically, particularly from their early years, to see what their sort of developmental pathway was. If you're looking for a checklist, you'll definitely find one on like the BDA, the British Dyslexia Association website. You'll find one also on the ELT Well website. You can get a free sort of starter kit, which includes the observation schedule and a little checklist to go through if you go to the ELT Well website to get you started. When you work through that, you might find there are some students that you want to go a bit further, what we call a screening. It's not quite a formal assessment. It's a kind of, more exploratory tasks, maybe asking them to, if they can write in another language, to see what they can do in another language, in their own language, or asking them to do a little task to see what their memory is like. So just some little informal tasks just to check out the things that you're worried about. And it may be that from that, actually, you've got enough information about what their strengths are and what their areas of difficulty are, that you can tailor your teaching and you can put in place the intervention that you think would be helpful. And that might be all you need to do. You might not need to go the next step, because the next step would be to have a formal assessment. And with that comes dyslexia assessor saying, oh no, we can't assess the student. And also, you get the whole trauma of a formal assessment, possibly a label, which may or may not be helpful for your students. If you've got learners who are hoping to go on and do formal qualifications, this might be the way you need to go in order to get exam arrangements in place. But it won't be necessary for everybody, not by any means. And for an assessment, for a formal assessment, you would need a qualified assessor. So, but I'm sure any assessor that you ask to look at your student would be very, very grateful if you've done some of this background work first, and, for example, gathered quite a lot of the background information for them, because that's something that assessors can really struggle with. But teachers often have a lot of background information, and students are much more likely to open up to their teacher than they are to some random assessor that comes in one afternoon. So, it could be a sort of joint project that you could help each other with that. I mean, you and the assessor could help each other with that. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'll just check the chat and see if there's any questions in here. Julie's saying hard to observe online. Yes, it is. Yes. Fatima's, is that a big smile, Fatima, for 8th of March? Are you looking forward to that? And Megan's asking, what about the world of work? These things affect employment as well, not only education. Absolutely right, Megan, absolutely right. And students who go into the workplace don't suddenly lose their dyslexia. Yeah, assessment can be helpful. And I find myself more and more doing workplace assessments for adults as people become more aware in the workplace. And of course, legislation also protects people who have a formal identification of dyslexia. It's classed as a disability under the Equality Act. So there is, there's quite a strong argument there for having a formal assessment, because you can access resources from like Access to Work and so on. You can get additional software, you can get mentoring, training. So yeah, definitely in the workplaces, there's definitely need for it there. Oh, I've just missed a question, I think. Joe, can you, it keeps scrolling and I keep missing it. Oh, Joe's asking if there's a recording. Oh no, that's Elizabeth.
Yeah, don't worry, I'll deal with the recording ones, Anne Margaret, don't worry. There is a great question, actually, because, and I would selfishly quite like an answer to this, but has anyone ever raised it as discrimination in terms of institutions not providing the same services to all learners? The example being that student support can't support an ESOL learner and tends to send them back to the ESOL department.
Has anybody ever raised it? I have.
Excellent.
But I've never taken anyone to court over it. It is a form of discrimination. I don't know if any ESOL, see, the thing about ESOL learners, as we know, they don't always, they're not always aware of what potentially their rights could be. They don't always have the language to argue. Then, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I do think that there are organisations like the organisation that I coordinate for Ioteful, the Inclusive Practice Nurse, who sometimes would get involved in things like this. But yeah, I mean, Sue, that would be great actually to have that as a little project in your ESOL group, a kind of advocacy project, maybe looking at rights and discrimination, and yeah. I think it tends to be raised on an individual basis rather than as a sort of, what do they call that? A class act or a
class action?
Class action, thank you. Yeah.
A class action going, yeah. Why not? There are quite a few questions coming through, Anne Margaret.
Great.
So let me just go through them, because I know you're trying to think and talk and I can read for you. So okay, can you recommend any post-grad qualifications specialising in ESOL and SPLDs? That's from Joe.
There used to be one at Birmingham. It was run by Maria Reraki, R-E-R-A-K-I, Reraki, Maria Reraki, at Birmingham. That might be worth looking into to see if that's still running. I do think it's been quite woeful, actually. We tried to start one at the University of Cumbria here, and we got shut down after 2 years. I mean, it's just like universities just don't see the potential. And I don't know. But check out Birmingham. There's lots of informal CPD, but if you're specifically looking for a qualification, like a postgraduate qualification, they're very few and far between.
Are there ESOL resources and teaching techniques that can be used?
Well, Joanna, I'm very glad you asked that. Shall I just go through my next few slides?
Yeah.
And then come back to any questions that are left.
Sure.
So we've talked about what we might look out for, and then what we might do if we think that some of our learners may have a specific learning difference of some kind. These are the CAML materials that I've been talking about. The blue one is for adults, for older learners. The green one is for younger learners. There is also an online course associated with it, so you can find these on the ELT Well website. If you feel like it's something you'd like to pursue and maybe you want just a bit of guidance on, you know, what to do, how to get started, there's an online course that's running now. I mean, it's, you know, you sign up whenever you want to and work at your own pace. It takes about 8 hours, I think. I should know. It takes 8 hours. And that just, you know, gives you sort of pointers on how to make the most of the CAML assessment materials. In terms of teaching materials, you will also find on the ELT Well website some activity books. So the purple one there is about so activities that you can use to help students develop memory strategies or organizational skills. The pink one is about raising awareness. So maybe you do a little activity with a class and then people start to understand what it's like for somebody who's dyspraxic, for example. And the one on the right is musical activities. Activities that you can use with the whole class, which draw on some of the key elements of music, which also overlap with language as a way of sort of drawing attention to certain aspects of language, like pitch change, for example, or volume. I don't know if you've got any students whose volume is an issue. I do, but I'm in Lancashire, you know, it's Milltowns. So, so sometimes volume, you know, people are not aware of what impact that's having on their listeners, the volume that they're using. So activities that start with music and then move into applying that into language use, it's quite good fun. You don't need to be a musician to run these activities. I'm not a musician, but I worked with a musician to make sure we could make it easy for teachers. There's also a course about understanding neurodiversity, which is looking at, you know, what we've looked at very briefly this evening, but in a lot more detail. So those are some resources there. This is the Ioteful SIG group that I'm the coordinator of. You can find our website. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter. We do talk about specific learning differences quite a lot. We're actually, our next event is talking about visual impairment, language learning and visual impairment. So you'll find all of that on our website and social media. And yeah, back to the questions, if there are any more, Pauline.
I'm just going to scroll up. Here we go. Could it be legally difficult for FE colleges if they refuse to give extra support to SPLD students in exams?
Could it be legally difficult? If the student was to make a complaint and invoke the Equality Act, yes. I think, and this sounds really cynical, but I think what a lot of colleges count on is that ESOL students either don't know that they can do that or don't have the, you know, the language resources to do it. But maybe you're cultivating feistier ESOL students these days. Maybe be a way forward.
Megan suggests surely there'd be a problem that they couldn't prove discrimination until they get assessed. Is it like a vicious circle?
Could be, yeah. So, but if you were to do some initial evaluation and show that there were definitely some issues around memory or speed of processing, for example, that might be enough, you know, because that would then justify your request for an assessment. So.
Excellent. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? You can raise your hand if you want to speak straight to Anne Margaret herself, or you can pop a question into the chat box and I can ask on your behalf.
And can I just say as well, if anybody is like me, and it'll be tomorrow or possibly Wednesday when the questions actually formulate properly in your brain, my email address is there if you'd like to contact me afterwards. I'm very happy to answer any questions at all. I know, you know, sometimes you take in a lot of information and you need to process it before you know what it is you wanted to ask. So
I agree. There isn't anything coming through Anne Margaret yet, but as Anne Margaret has said, you know, feel free to go straight to her. You can also come to me if you want me to pass anything on. We're literally like 30 seconds away from 8 o'clock. You've timed that absolutely perfectly. I hope everybody has enjoyed this presentation as much as I have. It's such a specialist area within ESOL that is becoming more relevant, I think, as every academic year that goes by. I think it's so important that we need to understand techniques and skills to support our learners in the best way possible. So I hope, I certainly have got something to take away from this evening, Anne Margaret. So thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you here on the Ioteful Scotland webinar series. So
thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who came out tonight. I say came out.
Yeah, I know. Well, this is the new coming out, isn't it? This is the new going out to be for CPD.
Everyone who stayed in to see this tonight.
Yes, we stayed in. So thank you very much, everybody. We hope to see you again at another Ioteful Scotland webinar series. We have one every month this year. This is a new venture for us, and it's proving to be brilliant so far. And everyone is always welcome to join us. Thank you. Take care, and I hope to see you again. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.